Hi, I'm Dr. Emma Milne, and today I'm talking about crisis pregnancies. So, crisis pregnancies is a term that I've coined and used in my research. It's not referring to crisis pregnancy centres, so you might have heard or read about those online. Crisis pregnancy centres are pretty much run in the US, we don't really have them over in the UK. But they advertise themselves as offering women support if they become pregnant and they don't want to be pregnant. But actually, in reality, what they are is advocates against abortion, and they effectively try and convince women to not have abortions. That's not what I'm talking about. So crisis pregnancy centres are very different to the concept of a crisis pregnancy. So I coined this phrase, crisis pregnancy, as a consequence of the research that I've done, and there's other videos about my research, so you can go and check those out to learn more about how I've thought up and used this concept. But from the cases that I've looked at, from women who have experienced crisis pregnancies, it seemed like the appropriate term to use to define what was going on for them and what their pregnancy meant. So all of these women were in situations where when they became pregnant, it effectively caused them a form of crisis. Now that the consequence of that crisis manifested itself in different ways, and I'm going to talk about that in a future video rather than today. So it's more about the situation that that woman was in and the context around her pregnancy that resulted in her understanding and experiencing her pregnancy as a crisis. So we are talking about women who are living in a serious amount of poverty, so they're really struggling in terms of socioeconomic deprivation, women who are living in abusive relationships, so either with partners or possibly abusive relationship from wider family members. And again, that abuse doesn't necessarily mean it's being physical violence. It can very easily be coercive control, emotional abuse. You know, those are just as damaging to women and can really lead them to be fearful as to what will happen if people find out that they're pregnant. Another case from the research was of a teenage girl who was raped, and as a consequence of being raped, she was suffering post-traumatic stress, which meant that every time she thought about the pregnancy, she relived the rape. So we're talking about women who are in incredibly desperate situations, hence the word crisis. The pregnancy has caused them a crisis. Now, crisis pregnancy doesn't necessarily mean an unwanted pregnancy. It's a very difficult relationship here between what does it mean for a pregnancy to be unwanted and what does it mean for a pregnancy to cause a woman a crisis. The reality is that a woman might in fact want her pregnancy, but feel that she can't be pregnant because of that wider social context. So I like to refer to these, rather than as unwanted pregnancies, I like to refer to them as unauthorized pregnancies. Now, when I say unauthorized, what I'm talking about there is that the wider social environment around that woman, so that could be the individuals around her, her circumstances, but it can also be wider society and the messages that women receive from wider society, effectively tell that woman that her pregnancy is unauthorized for one reason or another. And we can see these messages reflected in society all around us. So we can think about the fact that when young women get pregnant, so teenage girls particularly get pregnant, that seemed to be a really bad thing in this country. Teen pregnancy is seen to be a really negative thing that we need to stop. But we then have a similar aspect around if women get pregnant when they're considered too old. Geriatric pregnancies is often how they're referred to. That's also seen to not be okay by society. If women are too poor, so if they're living in levels of socioeconomic deprivation, it's widely considered that they probably shouldn't be having babies that are beyond their economic means. And we can see that not only in wider discussion that is in the media and in social discourse, but we can also see that in government policy. So the government still has a cap on the number of children that women can claim child tax credits and benefits for. It's limited to 2 children. So if she has more than 2 children, the government is effectively telling that woman that any future child is unauthorized because they're not prepared to help her pay to raise and support that child. But we also see this sort of discourse around women who are too rich. So the idea of a woman being too posh to push when she's pregnant and trying to give birth to that baby. So The crazy thing about these discourses about unauthorized pregnancies is that they're completely contradictory. There's a whole host of women who are effectively seen that their pregnancies are always going to be unauthorized. So we can think particularly about disabled women and some of the horrendous narratives we see about, is it right that a disabled woman has a baby? We see this particularly around women from minoritized ethnicities. The question of, is there a problem about certain groups of women having babies? Like, these messages are entrenched with racism, with ableism, as well as with, queries about asylum seekers. Should asylum seekers be having children? They're really, really horrible negative messages that effectively suggest that certain human beings are more worthy of life than others. Yet they exist and they perpetuate in our wider society, telling women whether or not to become pregnant would be considered to be authorised or not. So there's loads of reasons why a woman might experience a crisis pregnancy when there's all of these narratives going on, and then you add on to that incredibly difficult life circumstances, like I was talking about earlier in the video. All of this could very easily lead a woman to experience a crisis pregnancy. One of the things particularly, though, that can exacerbate that is if a woman can't access abortion or struggles to access abortion. Because if a woman is experiencing a crisis pregnancy, what she needs is the support in able to make the decisions that are right for her and right for her environment and her situation. That doesn't necessarily mean an abortion will be the right decision for her. She might decide it's not. But if she does decide that she wants to end that pregnancy, she needs the support that she can get to do that. Now, a big question that's in the news at the moment and in politics at the moment is whether or not early medical abortion at home, so home use of medical abortion pills, should be continued. The government have announced that they're going to end it at the end of August 2022. I would argue, and my research would certainly support, that if we get rid of telemedical abortion, home use of pills, then actually we're going to have more women experiencing crisis pregnancies because they're not going to have access to the abortions that they need. They're not going to be able to find their way to clinics and therefore get that support. It's much easier for them to do it if they're able to do it over the phone. And surely supporting women in crisis has got to be one of our number one priorities. If you want to find out more about telemedical abortion, why it's important and why we need to keep it, then do check out my last video, which talked about that. But here's, there's some wider impacts around how we understand women who experience crisis pregnancies and the consequence of that crisis pregnancy for women. And I'm going to be talking a bit more about that in future videos.